Okay. Hi, everybody. It's 2 o'clock, so we are going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first ever EI Live session brought to you by the Earth Institute at Columbia University. So my name is Cassie, and I'll be helping moderate and facilitate the session today. We thank you for joining us during these very uncertain times, and I hope everyone is doing well. I want to start with a bit of an introduction about the Earth Institute for those of you who may not be familiar with us. The Earth Institute blends research in the physical and social sciences, education and practical solutions, and we work towards sustainable development. Experts that make up the Earth Institute include earth scientists, economists, business and policy experts, specialists in public health and law, researchers, teachers, and students. We're made up of more than 24 research centers and several hundred individuals who collaborate across many disciplines and schools across Columbia University. What we're hoping to do with these EI Live sessions starting today until the end of June is to introduce you to our interdisciplinary work through our experts and through presentations and demos and such. Over the next little while, we'll feature a variety of these sessions, both for K-12 students and educators, and we'll also be building on the EI Live series to include other content. So we'll definitely share that when it's all available. The title of today's session is In a Disaster, the Buck Stops Here. And we're very lucky to have Jackie Ratner and Jeremy Brooks of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness joining us. They'll be discussing a very relevant topic with us today, which is the role of the three branches of government in disasters. We'll have Jackie and Jeremy do their presentations and then open it up for questions towards the end. If you do have a question, please either type it into the chat box, which is just to the right of this presentation screen on YouTube, or you can email me the question directly if you don't want to write it in the chat box. Once their session is done, after today, we will share a link with everyone registered for the event so you can access the recording later on. Please be patient with us. This is our first time doing this remote session, and we may have a few hiccups. If for whatever reason things go down, we will continue to record the session on our end, and we'll send out a complete presentation to everyone registered on this list. As a reminder, Jackie and another colleague, Josh, will actually be doing part two to this session on Wednesday, April 8th at 2 p.m. as well. If you haven't signed up for that and you would like to, please do so via the Eventbrite links. If you have any questions about how to sign up for future sessions as well, please contact me directly. We will be doing these on Mondays and Wednesdays from today until the last week in June at 2 p.m. And so you can always expect content from us on those particular dates and times. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jackie and Jeremy.
Hi, Cassie. Thank you so much for having us here. We are really looking forward to doing this today. So I am Jackie Ratner. I am Senior Project Manager at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. As Cassie said, we are one of the centers, one of many centers that makes up the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And I'll just quickly kick it over to my colleague, Jeremy, who is also going to be presenting today. So, yeah.
Hi, yes, so great to be here. Thank you again, Cassie, and to the rest of the hosts at the Earth Institute. I'm Jeremy Brooks, Senior Program Coordinator here at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University. And we're excited to be talking to you guys today.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with an introduction. Jeremy is going to come in and talk about some of the branches of government, and then I'll close this out and we'll open it up for questions. As Cassie said, feel free to enter your questions into the chat box, and she will be helping us keep track of all of that. So here we go. So for anybody who isn't already familiar with this saying, the buck stops here. It's essentially just a colloquial saying, a kind of slang for saying that where the responsibility for something lies. So when we're talking about disasters in government and we're talking about the buck stops here, we're talking about who is responsible for what aspect. When a disaster occurs, who's responsible for doing what? Oh, and my buttons aren't working. So as a quick reminder, because I'm sure most people already remember this, we have three branches of government in the United States. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And that's across the top of the screen here. If you look down the left, you'll see that we've also separated it out by federal, which is the whole country, state level, and local level. So these three branches exist across our nation at the federal level. At the federal level, we have Congress, which is Senate and the House of Representatives. So those are elected officials from different districts and from each state. At the federal level, the executive branch is made up of the president, the vice president, the president's cabinet, who are appointed by the president, and the EOP, which is the executive office of the president. So frequently, the people who see in press conferences, such as the press secretary or the president's chief of staff. The judicial branch at the federal level is made up of the US Supreme Court and also the federal court. And all of this is reflected as well at the state level. So at the state level, you will have a state legislature, also elected representatives. You'll have a governor who's the leader, the head of state for that specific state. Here in New York, we have Governor Cuomo. And then you also will have some state courts as well. And all of those things exist again at the local level, in your town or in your city. You'll have a city council or some other sort of elected representative. You'll have a head of state who might be a mayor. In some places, it might be a sheriff. And then you also have your local court. So 3 branches of government. And what we want to talk about today is what those branches are all responsible for doing before, during, and after a disaster. It's important to be able to understand the disaster cycle. So when we have a disaster, it's not just that one time. Sometimes we have disasters, for instance, we have hurricane season. So we have a season of disasters for that. Disasters, we oftentimes forget that there's a before and an after because we focus so much on when the disaster is actually happening. But that's just one small part of the entire cycle. So when a disaster happens, the first thing right after that is disaster response. And so in disaster response, for instance, with what's happening right now, the first thing that has to happen is the executive branch will declare the disaster. That's really important. We're going to go into more detail about that. Jeremy especially is going to talk about why that's so important and how it works. We might see in that response phase, so immediately after a disaster or kind of as something is unfolding, we might also see the legislative branch taking some action. They might make new laws or appropriate funds. Appropriation might be a word that you're not familiar with. Don't worry, we're going to talk about it more. It has to do with money. Response, as time starts to go on, and the immediate needs of the disaster have already started to be met, we transition into something like recovery. So for instance, recovering from a flood might involve rebuilding structures that have already been flooded. So when we do recovery, when we're in that phase, we might start to see things like the judicial branch getting involved. There might be some lawsuits or some cases, people looking for money that they think they were entitled to, things like that. And we might start to see the legislative branch starting to fix the laws that they already made or start to make some changes. Recovery oftentimes can start to, again, overlap with prevention and mitigation. So even though on this diagram, it looks like there's just 4 very separate parts of the disaster cycle, that's not actually how it works in the real world. In the real world, it's a little bit fuzzier. The lines between them are a little bit fuzzier. So as an example, if you think about recovering from a flood, as you're rebuilding a house that's been flooded, we might also be elevating it. So we might rebuild it in such a way that it's higher than it was before. So while we're recovering, it's also mitigation. Mitigation means that we're trying to reduce the effects of some sort of future event that hasn't happened yet. So while we're recovering from the flood and rebuilding a house, we might also be mitigating by raising the house up to minimize the effect of a future flood. Now that's different from preparedness. Preparedness is more closely linked to a specific disaster. So for instance, if you're preparing for a hurricane, you might board up windows or make sure that you have batteries in your flashlight. So this is the disaster cycle. A disaster occurs, we have an immediate response, a longer recovery, and then we start to transition into prevention and mitigation, and then more specifically, preparedness. And during all of these parts of the disaster cycle, governments are doing something at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. So we want to get more into what each of those branches of government are doing at different parts of the disaster cycle. So we're going to start by talking about the legislative branch. The legislative branch of government, again, as a reminder on the left-hand side of the presentation, this is more general. At the federal level, we're talking about Congress, which is Senate and the House of Representatives. We have 2 senators from each state. We have people in the House of Representatives are called congressmen or congresspeople. That's based on population. In the context of disasters, what the legislative branch is responsible for doing, the first thing is making appropriations. We're going to get, again, more into that. Right now, just think of it as meaning that they're borrowing money. The legislative branch also makes laws. So for example, right now, in response to the pandemic, 2 new laws have passed through Congress. One is the CARES Act and one is the Families First Act. And it's important to remember as well that the legislative branch is made up of elected officials who were chosen by the people, and they're responsive to the needs of their constituents. Their constituents are the people that they represent. It's also important to remember that based on public perception, elected officials might have people might be asking for certain things based on public perception. And so the laws that they make and the actions that they take are responding to that. So let's talk about this big word, appropriations. Appropriations, we can think of it as like a legislative emergency response. So it's something that we want to do like right away. Appropriations are when Congress makes a decision to spend money on a specific issue. In this case, it would be a disaster. So in response to a disaster, Congress has money that they're able to take from a fund, which in this case is the Disaster Relief Fund. America has had a disaster relief fund since 1948. Before that, there wasn't a specific fund for it, but the government did spend money on disasters as local occurrences happened and as the requests were made. But in 1948, they decided it would be a good idea if we just had a fund that existed all the time, like an emergency fund, kind of the same concept as when you put some money in a piggy bank or you tuck it away for a rainy day fund, same sort of idea. So last year in 2019, the Disaster Relief Fund had $29 billion in it. And that sounds like a really big number, but then we also have to remember that sometimes big disasters can cost hundreds of billions of dollars. So 29 billion is a lot of money, and it's great that we have that, but it's not going to be enough to cover every disaster that happens in America. And because it's not always enough, we have what's called a cost sharing requirement between the federal government and state government. So even though Congress can appropriate money from the Disaster Relief Fund in response to a particular disaster, it's not going to be enough all the time. So there's a cost sharing requirement, which means that the federal government might say, we can give this much, but then the state has to be able to match that amount of money with their own fund. Now, really importantly, in 2018, so only 2 years ago, the Disaster Relief Fund was expanded so that now we are allowed to use it for mitigation and preparedness. So if you remember the disaster cycle, we used to only be allowed to appropriate money for response and recovery. And that makes it tough to minimize future disasters if you're always just responding and recovering. So now it's a good thing that since 2018, we can appropriate money for both mitigation and preparedness as well. So we made a quick mention of 1948. We can kind of think of 1948 as being the beginning of kind of disaster response in an organized way with the federal government in the United States. That was the Deficiency Appropriations Act. So there's that word again, appropriations. It really started with the money. So the question of what to do in a disaster was initially a question of what to do with money in a disaster. And then it wasn't until 1974 that the Disaster Relief Act was established, which was the first law beyond just the money. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was created in 1979. So it's still a pretty young organization within the federal government. And then the modern era of disasters, the way that we handle them in the United States, started where you see the timeline shift from blue to yellow here with the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. It's a long title, so we tend to just call it the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act was enacted in 1988, older possibly than many of the people viewing this webinar right now. I myself was very young. And so when the Stafford Act was enacted, that was the first time that we really standardized as a federal government how the nation was going to respond to disasters. And then since then, we've seen revisions to the Stafford Act or additions to the way that we handle disasters. So in 2000, we saw the Disaster Mitigation Act. So as you can see from the name, it focuses on mitigation specifically. And look at that time gap from 1988 to 2000. It took a while before we realized that mitigation was really someplace that we needed to focus our resources. Jeremy's going to talk more about a lot of this as a whole, and he's going to talk more specifically in a little bit about in 2006, we had the Post-Katrina Emergency Reform Act and the PET Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act. And I know that might sound a little crazy. Why are we writing legislation about pets in disasters? But it's actually really important. And we have a couple more examples of what we're calling responsive legislation here as well. And so with that, I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Jeremy Brooks, and he's going to talk more about the Stafford Act and the other ways that the legislative branch acts in disasters. So Jeremy, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jackie. And that was a great overview. To go into the Stafford Act a bit more, you can see him actually there on the right. That's Robert Stafford of Vermont. This is, as Jackie was saying, kind of a way to centralize and really just formalize kind of what emergency management was leading up to that. So it's really to bring the authority to the federal government and then just really also encourage state and local governments to create their own plans. So their own emergency plans, their own emergency management departments and otherwise. Because up until then, it was pretty ad hoc by each state. And they really want to say that we want to have a really cohesive vision for this. And as Jackie was saying as well, that this is focused on preparedness, mitigation, assistance to states, local governments, and otherwise. There's actually 28 different agencies that run these programs. And the most prominent and famous of them is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, formed in 1979. And that now falls under the Department of Homeland Security, which is a very large agency that deals with a lot of different issues, including immigration, emergency management, terrorism, and otherwise. And we also note there that there's a difference between interpretation of what is written. And even with some of this legislation, which is hundreds of pages, very extensive, very clear about budget lines, about where money can and cannot be used, there also is things that are up to really the really up to the executive branch, so FEMA or otherwise, to say, we think that this is something that we should prioritize, or this is something that does not fall within our jurisdiction, because there is still some ambiguity. There's a lot of different complicated situations that come up that we'll be going in a bit more in the next couple of slides that really kind of falls in those gaps. So with that, Jackie, would you mind going to the next slide, please? Thank you. So with this, the Stafford Act is broken down into 7 different titles, just different subsections of this huge legislation. So for the first one, it's more about just the overall declaration process, definitions, just findings about what they found when they did a big review of all this. Title 2 is disaster preparedness and mitigation assistance. That's helping create warning systems, and then also helping support federal and state programs for preparedness. So that's why we have like New York State Office of Emergency Management or New York City Emergency Management, and really how we have a lot more like something like this in every single state possible. Title 3 is more about major disaster and emergency assistance administration. That's the mitigation plan. So each community, state will or should have a plan to say, how are we going to really lessen the severity of a disaster? So how can we address flooding or fires or tornadoes? How can we make sure that people are impacted less by that? Also, a big part of that this title as well is non-discrimination. And then also included as well as a lack of liability. And we'll talk more about the non-discrimination as well in a sec. For Title 4, this is where we get into the really expensive and the really complicated programs as well. So this is more for the major disasters. So this includes debris removal. So when a hurricane hits or a fire or tornado, there's a lot of debris from homes or businesses or really any building you can imagine just lining the streets. And so usually the federal government will chip in and help cover the cost of actually moving this debris and getting rid of it and destroying it, or recycling it, whichever. This title also includes financial assistance for households, depending on the disaster and otherwise, unemployment assistance, legal services. It's a really large title. For 5, it's more about the process for declaration, the amount of assistance that go towards state, local governments, or otherwise. 6 is more about specific to really like emergency operations centers, which you can find really in almost any county or state. And they will be these centers where really people have, it's where you have everybody in the emergency management field together. So when they are activated, everyone's in the room there, you have emergency management, you have the first responders, firefighters, police as well. You have departments of health, you have really private sector, really have anybody and everybody involved with that there, just so they kind of address concerns to just really save lives and respond to issues as quickly as possible. And also this title also includes information sharing. And they also, one thing they acknowledge as well, and this goes back to the non-discrimination thing I mentioned 3, was they also mentioned people with special needs. And that's also important to think about as well, is again, what is special needs and how far should the federal government go to actually address them or to meet them halfway. And then Title 7 is a bit of a wonkier one. It's about buying American, ensuring that when you are getting services, it's an American soil, firearms policy, and then closing out grants, because a big part of this is just the federal government giving money to state and local governments and just saying, here's the process to actually close it out. And with that, the next slide, please. Thank you. So legislation in action, as Jackie was saying, in 2006, there actually was an update to the Stafford Act. And just to actually even bring it back further to the disaster relief fund, that's so we said $29 billion in the relief fund last year. Hurricane Katrina, which many of y'all maybe already quite familiar with, happened in 2005. It hit the Gulf Coast, especially Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. It was a Category 5 hurricane, which really refers to the speed of the winds, so very fast, very dangerous. It caused $125 billion in damage, displaced over 1 million people, and has led to about over 1,000 deaths. And a big part of that when they were looking at this after about how many things went wrong and how people were impacted, they discovered that when they were trying to give out evacuation orders, certain people were actually not evacuating because they didn't want to leave their pets behind. And for those who have pets, we have a pet here as well. I have a cat. He's not in here right now though. But 44% of people surveyed didn't want to evacuate because they want to leave their pets behind. So the government actually decided to be more responsive to that. That was an important need and important limitation as well. If you think about how people get more people to emergency shelters when push comes to shove. And so with this, it was the Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act. One thing with government, you'll notice they love acronyms. So if you look at that lettering there, Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards, it's PETS. So it's clever stuff from them. And then this actually required the local and state governments to include pets in plans and allowed federal funding to be used for pets in shelters. So that, again, like it may not have been limited specifically before, but it is now, or it's allowed now. Thank you, Jackie. Go ahead. And then now we're going to go more to the executive branch. And this kind of includes, like, as Jackie alluded to, it's a lot of these different things, like it's signing laws, vetoing laws, pardoning people, appointing judges, etc. And for the comes to disasters, think about a big part of what they do is they declare the disasters after the governor requests this. We'll go more into that process in the next couple of slides. They also appoint the heads of their agencies. So Homeland Security, which also includes FEMA, as we said, Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, like really all the different agencies. And then they also create executive orders as well to say how to enforce the laws and how to manage agencies. And so that's again, it comes up the interpretation, the policy aspects of it. So next slide, please. So what is a disaster? You can see a flow chart there on the right, but that's for a major disaster declaration. So there's really a sense where sometimes something might occur, a flood, a small fire, or otherwise, and the state or the city or otherwise will have the capacity to deal with it. And that may be like more internal disaster, but it's really when it gets out of the ability of the state or otherwise to actually address it. That's when it starts getting kicked up, and eventually the federal government may come in. So most of these big programs, as we're mentioning, the individual assistance, the money to people or to the governments or otherwise, that's a result of the major disaster declaration. But there's also a couple other declarations as well. President Trump, when the opioid crisis was really hitting the headlines, he actually was flirting with the idea of doing a major disaster declaration, but decided to make a public health emergency instead, which does add in certain funding and flexibility and otherwise, but it's not the full-on major disaster declaration. And you can see the process there on the right. They do the incident occurs, a fire, a flood, hurricane or otherwise. Local officials, county or the city, will go in, just get an idea about how much damage occurred. Eventually they'll work with the state and the federal government, FEMA, to actually really properly assess the damages. And eventually they'll get kicked up to FEMA, to the president, and the president will make a determination about whether or not this constitutes a full-on major disaster declaration. And there are a couple thresholds that they follow. Again, with government stuff, there's always an exception to the rule, but in this case, it's usually at least $1 million in infrastructure damage, so like a road or the subway or something, and then 1.43 damage per person. That's a weird way of thinking about it, but for New York City, it'd be like a little over $12 million affecting the city itself. And really, it's that disasters are bad, but a part of the Stafford Act and all these other things was just to really empower local governments and state governments to actually have the capacity to deal with this. And if it gets really bad, that's when the federal government steps in with more money, more assistance, and otherwise. Next slide, please. And so, as I was saying before, there's 20 different agencies involved with this. And our deputy director, our boss, Jeff, is always saying like that it's just way too many agencies. They really need to be streamlined. And each of them carry different or address different issues that happen with a disaster. It's these really complicated issues like social, economic, political issues that all come together. So this is 5 listed right here, and we're going to go through a couple of them. And there's 23 more agencies that are involved with this, which is pretty incredible, but we don't have time for all that. Thank you. But there's also an interesting power dynamic. So as I was saying, it's really the goal of the federal government is to kind of support everything. So either through money or through technical assistance, being like, this is how you should go about thinking, responding to this. And so emergency management, a common term that we use is that it's locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. And you can see that each of these, this is a map from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, showing a lot of these billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in 2019. And you see just a huge variety of the kinds of disasters. You see wildfires, hail, flooding, a hurricane there on the right. I mean, you get everything you can imagine. And so there's really a different idea about each community may have a better idea about what is their own hazard, what is their own way of actually addressing the issues at hand. So that's why they go with the idea of locally executed, state kind of helping provide the assistance as needed, maybe helping with the budget issues, providing more logistical support, anything else. And yeah, and then some city, oh, I'm sorry, one last thing is some cities and counties are actually big enough to do their own thing. So for example, New York City Emergency Management has a couple hundred employees. And when we've done trainings before, like I've done one in Nebraska, there was one person from like a county I was in, like central Nebraska, and they were like the one person. So it's like one emergency manager was also like, I think they're like the city clerk and like, you know, the head of like HR and everything else. So they can wear a lot of different hats. So it really depends on the size and the capacity. So some of them, New York City, Houston after Hurricane Harvey, which happened in 2017, they were able to kind of really work with the federal government more closely because they have the capacity and the amount of people to actually address that in time. So now next slide. So for the first lead agency to focus on is FEMA. They, as we said, they're kind of like the lead on all this stuff when it comes to disasters, not for everything, but most things. But they focus on preparedness, response, recovery. They do a couple of different things, but the ones we'll point out are public assistance. So this is giving money to the states, local government, and certain nonprofits. So for states, that could be like money to New York State directly, local government, New York City, and certain nonprofits as well, maybe like working on case management or other like specific help. It could be like the Red Cross, for example. For individual assistance, that's money that goes directly to people's households. So it could be things for housing, it could be things for helping cover costs of replacing items. It could be a lot of different things. They also do trainings and exercises. As I said before, we do a lot of trainings on or we have 5 different training grants. So they're all focused on post-disaster housing and post-disaster economic recovery. So that's one thing that they're supporting. They also have in-house training as well. There's exercises where they go through and help communities and states just really go through and rehearse what would happen in the event of, like, let's say a giant earthquake or a giant terrorist incident or something. There's also the National Flood Insurance Program. And that's really just kind of stepping in to help establish a more clear market. So they'll be the ones to kind of do the payouts, but now makes it so that a lot of people, really almost anyone throughout the country, can actually get flood insurance, which may have been is a more volatile market, especially as the amount of flooding increases in frequency and severity. And then, as I was mentioned before about the Emergency Operations Center, there's also one that works more at the federal level, and that's the National Response Coordination Center. And so that brings in all the different federal agencies, again, 28 or so, to actually go in and coordinate on who's doing what and how they're sending supplies out or providing staff or otherwise. And that's that. Next slide. There's also Health and Human Services. They've been, of course, a bigger name with related to COVID-19 because, again, this is a public health issue. And so one thing that's really come into headlines lately has been the Strategic National Stockpile, which is something that's been around for years. And they'll collect things like vaccines, they'll collect things like masks, ventilators, and otherwise. And in the hope that if a disaster does occur, that they will have the supplies to help the states, local governments really with what they need. For planning, they may help hospitals become more prepared for very specific issues, like when it could be Ebola, it could be COVID, it could be really any of these different issues, and understanding more about how to minimize the risk to the healthcare workers, but also to the patients as well. For response, they have a couple different entities they tap into. The Medical Reserve Corps is a voluntary group of people in different communities that will, when activated, they'll help assist the departments of health or otherwise with that. They're the Public Health Services, they're under the Surgeon General, and they will do a variety of different tasks, but it could be issues like natural disasters, but also could be like food safety incidents or otherwise, but they wear a lot of different hats. And the National Disaster Medical System is just like kind of reciprocation, saying that if a state's coming in from, or if you might have some people, staff coming in from other states or counties to help out with a big incident. So for New York City, calling a lot of health professionals for other places has been a big part of that as well. And I think that also interweaves with the National Disaster Medical System. And next slide. And then more specifically, also, and this is a big part of the most recent appropriations with COVID-19, but there's also the Small Business Administration, which is actually not just for businesses. And people kind of misunderstand that, unfortunately, including myself when I first started in this field. So what they'll do is they'll actually help provide low interest loans for business, and this isn't disaster settings, they also do many other things as well. but they'll provide low interest loans for businesses, homeowners, renters. This could be physical damage, so actual damage to the home, or economic injury, like a loss of business, for example. And so it could be up to 2 million for a business, up to 200,000 for a homeowner, and then up to 40,000 to replace damaged property. So it's not perfect, especially in New York housing prices. I see 200,000 for a homeowner, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of quaint for New York, but it still is something, and they are low interest. And so if you can't get that, there's of course always private funding, private loans as well. And next slide. And then there's the Housing and Urban Development. They're a very interesting agency dealing with a lot of different issues. And a big part that you can think about from the disaster front is mortgage assistance. So they can help insure loans to rebuild homes or stop foreclosures. They also have done work on affordable housing. So it could be home buying or rental assistance. They also have this big sort of grant that they do called the Community Development Block Grant. And this focuses on disaster recovery. And that really goes out to states and local governments are actually invited to apply for it if appropriated. And they actually can have, it's actually very specific in the way it can be used. So it can be used for economic recovery or housing or infrastructure or a lot of different ways. But the limitation is that a lot of the benefits have to go to low and middle income people. So there is an equity standpoint there as well. Next slide. And then just for the last bit about executive powers, for COVID-19, as I mentioned before about the disaster declaration process, you do see that very many states have had the major disaster declaration. So that, as we talked about with the full presidential process, but other ones have gotten the emergency disaster declaration. So you see that New York, really everything in the tri-state area is covered with the disaster declaration. You see like Wyoming, Nebraska, Arizona, New Mexico, they haven't had as many cases and not really kind of at the level of a major disaster declaration. But that may change as these events continue to unfold. So that's a bit more about the executive authority. And then I'll turn it back to Jackie for more about the judicial branch. So thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Jeremy. All right, so we're going to finish up talking about the three branches of government by talking about the judicial branch. I actually think this might be my favorite part of government in disaster, I guess because the sense of justice of it all. I really like the way that the justice system can create change in our country. So just as a quick reminder of what the judicial system does, they don't make laws, but they interpret them and decide if the laws are also abiding by the Constitution. In the Supreme Court, justices are appointed by the president, and they can also overturn rulings by other judges. So sometimes a case will start at a local level and work its way up to the federal level. But more broadly, at all levels, federal, state, and local, usually we don't see the judicial branch getting involved until a disaster has already happened or been declared. They tend to be more involved in the recovery process and in future mitigation of future disasters. And so some of the decisions that the courts make after a disaster in interpreting those laws might also have an influence on new laws that get written. So let's take a little bit of a closer look. So what are the different ways that courts can get involved in disasters? So we have civil suits, which are something like injury or property damage or disputes over money. Family cases can happen as well. For instance, if we think of a disaster where families are separated, or if there's an unfortunate, loss of life, something like that. And we also see criminal charges as well. So issues pertaining to fraud or more violent issues. But there's some pretty interesting ways that our justice system works in disasters. And I think it can be helpful to see specific examples. So here's an example of some civil charges. So in Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina, so if you remember, Jeremy was talking about Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005. A judge in the district court in Louisiana awarded over $700,000 after finding a federal entity, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, to be negligent. So in large part, a lot of the flooding during Hurricane Katrina was due to the levee system down in Louisiana, which was not well maintained. And that in itself is a big discussion of government to decide, how does the Army Corps of Engineers get the money to do the maintenance that they need to do? But regardless, in this instance, the buck stopped at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Louisiana judge found that organization responsible for negligence, and then was able to award $750,000 almost to people in Louisiana. When we talk about criminal charges, again, we have kind of more frequently we see issues pertaining to fraud or something like that. When in hurricane recovery, we might have companies come in that pretend to do rebuilding work and then they don't actually do it. So sometimes homeowners will have to take them to court. A really interesting thing that's happening right now, if you care to follow along in the news, PG&E is the Pacific Gas and Electric Company over in California. A couple years ago, there were massive wildfires, including one very deadly fire that was called the Camp Fire because of where it was, not because it was at a camp. PG&E, the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, it was determined that the source of the fire was due to some faulty and poorly maintained electrical equipment. And now PG&E has been taken to court and pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter. And so there will be a maximum $4 million in fines. So that has very interesting implications for the way that the courts interpret laws and the way that the courts assign responsibility when disasters happen that maybe did have a human origin. So in this case, the disaster was a fire, and it was started not by lightning, but potentially from a spark from this piece of electrical equipment. And then Jeremy had mentioned a little bit about the provisions in the Stafford Act, and some of which have to do with equality and equity. And so one instance where we really saw that applied was after Hurricane Sandy in New York City. The courts found that New York's emergency plans neglected to provide adequate provisions for the disabled. And they found that the emergency policies were discriminatory against disabled people. And so what that looks like in action, when our government takes action and when people advocate for change, in the short term, we saw that New York City was able to take 4 years to reassess the needs of the disabled in the city and to better incorporate that into emergency plans. And in order to facilitate that, they created a specific new position, a person and an advisory panel who could take care of that, the disability and access and functional needs coordinator. Now, in the longer term, all of this and this court case that happened just recently, so Hurricane Sandy was back in 2012, and it's been a while, but now in 2019, we saw a new act introduced in Congress, the Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion. And as Jeremy mentioned before, you'll notice the federal government loves its acronyms. So this reads as the READY Act, the Ready for Disasters Act. It is currently in Congress. It has not been made a law yet. It hasn't made it all the way through, but it's been introduced in both the House as HR 3208, and it's in the Senate as S1755. And so this is now going through the process of being talked about, being debated, and hopefully turned into law. So just to summarize how all of the 3 branches of government work, the responsibilities overall are the same in different disasters, but it's important to remember also that different kinds of disasters mean that different actions might be necessary or appropriate. So we've given some examples for hurricanes, flooding, campfires, and obviously we're in a pandemic right now. And so some of these things might look a little bit different depending on the disaster. In particular, if you remember what Jeremy was talking about with the executive branch and lead agencies, the lead agency in a disaster might have to do with the type of disaster. So, but the overall big muscle movements are going to be the same. So the executive branch is overall responsible for declaring a disaster and then enforcing laws and deciding how agencies are going to act during a disaster. The legislative branch is responsible for making emergency appropriations, so moving money around to respond to disasters, and enacting new laws that have to do with the disasters. And then the judicial branch is responsible for interpreting those laws, and that might turn into new laws down in the future. So with that, we are finished with our presentation, and we would be very happy to take your questions.
Great, thank you, Jackie and Jeremy. One of the first questions that we had was actually about the PG&E fire case, and the question was the fine cheaper or more expensive than if PG&E had done the right thing in the first place?
So actually, I was looking up as Jackie was talking, but Jackie, do you want to take a first stab at it, and then I'll give like the exact kind of number I found?
Oh, this is tough. This is like guessing how many M&Ms are in the jar, Jeremy.
Well, we don't do that then. So the answer is it was definitely more expensive, just given the amount of fines that they had in settling all the lawsuits. So I think last I checked, I believe PG&E had to settle like about, I think this final settlement was about like close to $30 billion, which is basically making them bankrupt. So essentially, yeah, I think it's definitely more expensive than the actual fine that they incurred. And of course, there was a variety of different fines as well, some at the local level, some from the state regulators as well. But in terms of the overall mitigation, I think that it would have been lower than 30 billion, to say the least.
I think it's important also to remember when we talk about litigation or some sort of legal action that winds up in court, sometimes it's symbolic as well. So for a private, not a private, but for a corporation to be able to be charged with manslaughter on account of negligence in a disaster, that's really a landmark for this thing that we're in, this disastrous world that we live in, or as my freshman year class called it, violent earth, as our violent earth is. So even if the money doesn't necessarily equate to the same amount of money that it would have been if they had, as you said, just done the right thing in the first place, it does set a legal precedent, and it does send kind of a warning flag to other corporations that might be similarly negligent or not paying attention to the way that their actions can affect disasters.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder to our viewers, if you do have questions, please use that chat box. Jackie and Jeremy, I'm curious, you talked a little bit about COVID, about Hurricane Katrina, about Sandy. Since you've been with the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, what other kinds of disasters and what other kinds of catastrophic events have you sort of worked on? What are some of the most perhaps interesting things that you've seen in your line of work?
Oh, okay. I would say, that's a very good question. I think I would say I think the hurricanes tend to be especially complex. It's really it's just a sheer, the projections of it are always difficult, just like it is with COVID-19. I would say also that it's just like the sheer levels of buildup and everything. So for example, one thing project I worked closely with was Hurricane Harvey. So we got funding from a supporter or a friend of our boss to actually go and support groups in Texas after. And so we actually had a chance to see across different parts of Texas about how Harvey impacted it. And so we saw that like in the eastern part, closer to Houston, there was a lot more flooding and everything. And then we went to more rural areas further down in the state. We saw there was more wind damage. So for them, we saw very different issues. So for the ones in the eastern part of the state, around Houston or Port Arthur or otherwise, they actually had to go through the process of having moldy homes and having to muck and gut their homes, which is a whole different kind of beast and craziness compared to people who were in the more, the more rural areas where actually with the wind damage, it's destroyed their home. There's no ambiguity. There's no uncertainty about, can I actually move back to my home? It's just not there. So we just saw a really varying different kind of response, especially in some of these places where there was more they're more underserved to begin with as well. So it's that does tend to be one that's the sheer scale of it is hard to see, but then it's also, you do also get to see some of the best people in the world like really respond to these huge issues. And then I'll leave it to Jackie from there.
Oh, no, I agree completely. So our center does put a particular emphasis on vulnerable populations in disaster. So a lot of the work that we do is designed to really help the people who most need it. And so I want to talk about one of the projects that I'm involved in, the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities project. But when you say something interesting that happened, I have to talk about this incredible coincidence that happened late last year. I was on my way to Arkansas to deliver a training for our community economic recovery, whole community economic recovery after disasters. And just the day before I was flying to Arkansas, there was a tornado right in the area around the airport. It was so, and I've never been, and I've never lived in an area that has tornadoes. I've never experienced one. And so to drive from the airport to the hotel and be prepared to deliver this training the next day, it just felt so incredibly relevant on that day and at that moment. And it wasn't even, I mean, the people who live in the parts of the country that have tornadoes, they weren't even really fazed by it because they're like, oh, it's just an F1. you should see what the big guys can do. But one of the communities that we work with down in Arkansas, they're involved in our Resilient Children, Resilient Communities initiative. And that entire project is really built around the concept that children are not given nearly enough consideration when we're planning for disasters. We can frequently forget that children are different from adults. They have their own set of needs, psychologically and socially and physically as well. And so the plans that we make for adults don't always translate into being the best plans for children. So we have to really think about the way that we do that. And we have a couple fantastic communities. We have 6 different communities from across the country and Puerto Rico who are involved in really getting their hands dirty, trying to make change and change the way that their community prepares for disaster and putting the focus of children right front and center. And like Jeremy said, our community partners is some of the best part of the work that we do. Some really inspiring people.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions from our audience. So the first one, so we have 3, so I'll read off the first one and give you 2 a chance to respond. And the first question is there accountability when a government entity fails to perform in a disaster?
I could just very quickly could point to the Army Corps of Engineers. That's what Jackie was saying on the judicial slide there. So they actually had a payout for that. There's also been lawsuits against FEMA, among other federal entities as well, for not really responding as needed. But it's a pretty gray line though about what constitutes criminal negligence. And so I think you'll see more and more of that as well, especially with COVID-19. I think it's gonna be a bigger idea about what is criminally liable and where is it a competence? Is it like black information? It's really under stressful circumstances that the governments have to respond. And so yes, there is definitely the possibility, but at least the amount of court cases I can think of is pretty few, at least at the federal level. I'm less sure about the state and local government though. And then Jackie?
Yeah, well, so there's also, the government has its own office that focuses on accountability. It's literally the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. And they'll put out reports on a pretty regular basis. Their entire job is to really analyze what different agencies are doing, not just in the context of disasters, but overall. But I really love the work that the GAO does, and they'll put out reports that really kind of demonstrate. Importantly, they get an inside look at the way that things are working, because that's frequently for us, even though this is a democracy. The internal workings of an agency, we don't always know if they're struggling with being understaffed, or if they really made the best use of the resources that they were able to get. Because we have to remember too that a lot of this does follow the money. And so, I'm not trying to say one way or the other, our agency is doing the best they can, but is there accountability was the question. And so there are a couple of different ways of doing that. Like Jeremy said, we can sometimes bring, charges of negligence or something like that, which would be more on the judicial side of things. But the executive branch does have its own kind of internal auditing process to determine if government agencies really are being accountable and if they are doing their job.
And sorry, Cassie, take that a step further. There's also, each agency will also have their own inspector general. So those, also called the IG, again, acronyms, government, but they also will actually do these really thorough investigations as well. And they act as the more internal conduit, internal reviewer, in addition to the government accountability office, which is more public facing. But if push comes to shove and there was, real negligence of failure, what may happen is they may pass on those charges to the Department of Justice or otherwise to actually prosecute them. So that is a case of that, actually very much like, not like if there is negligence or malice or otherwise, they can actually really take that up further.
Great. So the next question that we have from our audience is, how do companies or industry coexist with branches of government? Is it encouraged for them to participate in legislation and policymaking? And a follow-up to that was, how do you feel, for example, about having Tesla or GM involved in disaster response?
So these are kind of two different questions, right? So being involved in government isn't necessarily the same thing as being involved in disaster response, because there's an entire other end of disaster response that we didn't talk about today, which is the philanthropic side, or the NGO, the non-governmental organization. And that's an enormous part of disaster response and recovery and preparedness as well. And so frequently, when we see kind of corporations getting involved, maybe what we're seeing are their contributions to philanthropy. And that is its own Pandora's box, if you will. So there's an entire nonprofit dedicated to what are the best practices for this. It's called the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. And so, believe it or not, there are people that actually specialize in exactly what your question is. So how can corporations get involved? What is the best way? But the other kind of half of your question was, should they be involved in government? And that really isn't a disaster specific issue. How involved corporations are has a lot to do with the way that campaign finance might work. It has a lot to do with the way that lobbying works. And so that obviously it does factor into governance for disasters, but it's a bigger system outside of disasters specifically. And I don't know if Jeremy, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that was really great. I mean, there is like a big part of emergency management as well as always talking about private sector integration. So it could be like, ensuring that when push comes to shove, the supply chains are open, that emergency management in counties or cities or states can get the supplies they need. So really ensuring that that's an open relationship, that there's clarity there. For New York City emergency management, we had a pilot last week focusing on business disaster financial literacy. It was a half-day training. And that's a part of the private sector partnerships and private sector. I'm messing it up. It's a triple P thing, but they do really great work in terms of like just these updates to businesses and letting them know that they are looping them into the emergency operations center and just these certain questions that they may have that are specific to the business front, not so much the actual public health side. And then for New York City as well, they're trying to also really just kind of keep an open line with a lot of these different business that exists throughout New York City to see if they might be able to help contribute to creation of masks or to gowns or all these other supplies that are really, really needed right now. So yeah, so what Jackie said, but then also additionally there is an importance there, but it really depends on what avenue you're thinking of.
Great. And with 1 minute left, we have one more question. So this question is, the courts are mostly closed right now nationwide, we believe. How does this impact the court's role in this process? Is this unprecedented?
It's not unprecedented. Well, I mean, the pandemic is unprecedented, but the closure of courts isn't actually. And actually in doing research, putting all of this together, I saw a number of guidance documents issued kind of over the last decade to decade and a half, we don't normally think of courts as being involved in disasters. It's easy to kind of forget that they are part of the equation. And so the part of this that isn't precedented is that, courts are just as impacted by hurricanes. The ability of courts to operate is just like any other business out there. Their ability to maintain their operations, or what we call business continuity or continuity of operations, it's the same issues that courts face as any other business. Record keeping, being able to have personnel do their jobs, maybe some additional security issues when it comes to the types of sensitive information that courts are handling. So there are some courts, I imagine, just as with regular businesses, that are more prepared for business continuity than other ones might be. And I hope that some of them are able to continue their business as usual, or they'll be, facing a pretty significant backlog after this. But they operate as a business or an agency just like everybody else. So hopefully they had plans for that, continuity of operations plans.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to both of our presenters today. Again, if you're still with us and you do have additional questions, feel free to contact me. Jackie, I'm going to have you stop sharing your screen for a second. And then what I will do is share my screen here so that you can see if you have any questions about our sessions after today, please contact me directly at that email. That's first. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Earth Institute and what we're doing, we have a lot of great content on our blogs. We're also going to be, as I said, announcing additional sort of EI Live sessions, and we'll keep everybody posted on that. So as a reminder, Jackie is also going to be doing part 2 of this on Wednesday afternoon from 2 to 3 p.m. again. And we will follow that same schedule for all the other K-12 educators and student sessions that we have from now until the end of June. If there's specific topics you'd like to see, please, again, email me. We'd love to have your feedback. As I mentioned, this is our first time doing this, so we are still learning in this process as well. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you again to our presenters, and we hope that everyone stays safe and healthy out there. So please, we'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, all. Take care.